Okay, so we're ready for part 4 of the vessels, and here we're looking at systemic control through the autonomic nervous system. Now, I know that your book will tell you that there are parasympathetic nerves to the vessels, but it's unclear what the role of the parasympathetic nervous system is in regulating vessels. So we're going to focus on what we do know, which is what the sympathetic nervous system does. The control center for the vessels is called the vasomotor center, and again there's like a little center on both the right and the left, and each one controls that side of the body. The vasomotor centers are closely connected and interwired with the cardiac center, and collectively they're called the cardiovascular center in the medulla oblongata of the brain. So the sympathetic nervous system is mostly going to vasoconstrict, but there are specific vasodilations that occur in skeletal and cardiac muscle as a result of your fight or flight response. So here in this diagram, we just see the wiring from the vasomotor center in the medulla. Remember, sympathetic nervous system has to go down through the spinal cord to come out through the thoracic and upper lumbar nerves. It's going to go through the sympathetic chain, and out the sympathetic chain notice the synapses are in the sympathetic chain, so your preganglionic nerve fibers run to the sympathetic chain. They go out as postganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers. These are called the vasomotor nerves, and they go to both arteries and veins. Vasomotor nerves. So how do they know whether to constrict or dilate? Well, you've got to have some visceral feedback. So what we have is some reflexes. The first reflex we're going to look at is a category of reflex called baroreflex. And baro refers to barometer, which is a measure of pressure. So we have baroreceptors in these little stretchy points in the aorta and the carotid arteries called sinuses. So you have aortic sinuses and carotid sinuses. The carotid sinuses are right at the base of the head, right at the jaw, where the common carotid arteries end by branching into internal and external carotids. At that point, that's where the carotid sinuses are, and they're specifically monitoring blood pressure to the brain. So carotids measure blood pressure to the brain. Aortic sinuses measure blood pressure to the entire systemic circulation. The afferent nerves that run from these sinuses are the vagus and glossopharyngeal. These are the nerves you learned last semester that are associated with regulating blood pressure. We're just kind of following up on that story. The aortic sinuses connect to the vagus nerve. The carotid sinuses connect to the glossopharyngeal nerves. And remember, that's right and left. So they're going to send impulses to both the vasomotor centers in the medulla and the cardiac centers. And then from vasomotor center, we're going to get the vasomotor nerves. From the cardiac center, we're going to get the cardiac nerves. Those are your sympathetic nerves. If the blood pressure is too high and you're trying to lower it, then the vagus will carry parasympathetic innervation to the heart. But remember, as far as we know, there is no parasympathetic innervation to the vessels. So we're focusing just on the arteries. We've already learned about the heart. Here in this diagram, you can see the aortic arch baroreceptors. The carotid sinus baroreceptors are not labeled in the correct place because they've got the carotids cut off too short. It's really up at the head. Notice glossopharyngeal carrying impulses from carotids, vagus carrying impulses from aortic arch baroreceptors. They're going to the cardioregulatory and vasomotor centers in the medulla. Sympathetic nerves out, just as we saw in the other figure, but now we've just added in that sympathetic pathway to the heart. All right, now here's just a more realistic diagram since the other one messed up. The aortic baroreceptors are in a couple of little patches there, and then up as the common carotid ends by branching into internal and external. That's where you see the carotid sinus. Also in this figure, you see the carotid and aortic bodies. These bodies are just little clusters of sensory receptors that respond not to pressure but to chemical senses. These are chemoreceptors, and they're going to give us a chemoreflex, which we'll study later. So in terms of regulating pressure, it's the afterload that the aortic sinus is measuring. Now, we studied afterload very briefly when we studied the heart. Afterload is simply the workload the heart has to perform to overcome the high blood pressure in the aorta. So if your high systolic pressure in the aorta is 120, then there's a certain amount of force that the left ventricle has to generate to get a pressure higher than 120 to be able to pump the blood out through the aorta. If your systolic pressure is 140, then you've got to work even that much harder to get blood just to move. So afterload has to be regulated very carefully. If it's too high, then the heart is simply working too hard to get blood flowing. Cor pulmonale is a right ventricular failure. If there's an obstruction in the pulmonary circulation, then the pressure in the pulmonary circuit gets too high. Now, typical pulmonary circulation, the blood pressure on the pulmonary side is only about 25/10. Contrast that with a 120/80 in the aorta. So it doesn't take much to get the pressure in the right side too high. This is one of the main problems with pulmonary embolism. You've got this blockage in the pulmonary circuit and the right side fails because the right ventricle is just not adapted to creating such a high pressure. This very busy diagram I'm going to leave for you to go through on your own, study it in the book, make sure it makes sense to you, but notice at the top we're increasing the baroreceptor reflex to bring the pressure up, and in the lower one we're trying to bring it down. All right, so now we'll talk about those chemoreflexes, and remember they are, their sensory receptors are clustered in the aortic and carotid bodies. Same nerves are involved, same output is involved, but in the chemoreceptors, what we're responding to is low oxygen, high CO2, and low pH. And let me tell you this, these chemoreceptors in this peripheral circulation are much more responsive to CO2 and pH than they are to oxygen. And we'll understand why when we get to the respiratory system. So if your CO2 level rises even a little bit, that drives the pH down because CO2 acts as an acid, and that then influences brain activity. So we want to maintain normal CO2 and pH, and then the oxygen, under normal circumstances, the oxygen level will rise when CO2 falls. So as long as you're regulating CO2, then by default you're regulating oxygen. So notice our nerves are the same, our response centers are the same, and what you need to know is that high CO2 is going to raise blood pressure so that you can increase flow of blood to the lungs, so you can get rid of that excess of CO2. All right, so hypercapnia is the term for high CO2. Acidemia means low pH in the blood. Hypoxia is low oxygen, and it's less of a stimulus than the CO2 or the acid. All those things are going to stimulate chemoreceptors. You're going to increase blood flow to the lungs. You're also at the same time going to increase ventilation of the lungs. So we'll worry more about the details of this when we get to respiratory regulation. Now, here's a little odd thing. It's called the medullary ischemic reflex. And ischemia means low flow. So if you have a drop in cerebral perfusion, that is blood flow to the brain drops, it's going to be regulated by the medulla, and the result is a widespread vasoconstriction. So that's just, it can be stimulated by mood, so emotional responses that some people have can stimulate the medullary ischemic reflex. The mammalian diving reflex is seen obviously in diving mammals such as seals and walruses and dolphins and whales. The diving reflex vasoconstricts broadly the systemic circulation so that blood flows from the right side of the heart out to the lungs. Of course, they're holding their breath. And then from the lungs back to the left side, and the left side, almost everybody's vasoconstricted except for the heart and the brain. So blood flows through the pulmonary circulation, then up to the brain, then back to the pulmonary and up to the brain, and most of the rest of the body is simply vasoconstricted. Obviously, there are limits to that. Diving mammals are well adapted to that, so they can dive for various periods of time. Is this seen in humans? Actually, yes, it is. We used to demonstrate this in lab. You can immerse someone's face in cold water and see an immediate boost in blood pressure and obviously in blood flow. And it's also seen in emergency situations when children fall through the ice on a cold pond, and it takes a while to find them. Usually they are, the younger they are, the better off they are, and some of them can be submerged for 30 minutes and still have no discernible brain damage because they've triggered this mammalian diving reflex. All right, so now we're going to talk about hormonal control. You have two lists here, things that raise blood pressure and things that lower blood pressure. So make sure you know the elements on each of those two lists. ADH is antidiuretic hormone, epinephrine and norepinephrine, and then our blood pressure decreasers are atrial natriuretic peptide and brain natriuretic peptide. And those are named for the organs where they were first discovered. So we'll go through each of these in turn. And the first one is called the renin-angiotensin system. Some people call this renin instead of renin. I don't really care, but it comes from the kidneys. So renin sounds better to me. It helps you remember it's coming from the kidneys. And there's another enzyme called renin, R-E-N-N-I-N, which is part of your digestive system, and so it helps to keep them separate. All right, so renin is secreted by your kidneys when there is low blood pressure to the kidneys, to the renal arterioles. We'll see this in more detail when we study the kidneys. For now, you just need to know low blood pressure to the kidneys causes secretion of renin. Renin is an enzyme, and its substrate is found in the plasma. It's one of the plasma proteins that's always circulating. This substrate is the protein called angiotensinogen. When you see O-G-E-N at the end of a name, it means it's going to convert to whatever the first part of the name is. So angiotensinogen becomes angiotensin. And since angiotensin is found in two forms, this is called angiotensin 1. So imagine where you are. Renin was secreted basically into the renal venous drainage. It starts doing its job as the blood is flowing through the inferior vena cava back to the right side of the heart. It's going to go out to the lungs, and by then you have some angiotensin 1. Well, as it gets to the capillaries in the lungs, there's another enzyme there called angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE for short. And it's just in the lining of the endothelium of the lung capillaries, and it converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. So now the blood is flowing back to the left side of the heart with angiotensin 2 activated. It's going to go out to the circulation and the systemic side, and there it is going to exert very powerful vasoconstricting effects. So it causes systemic vasoconstriction almost immediately, and the effect might last for, say, a minute or so. So here's the diagram in your book. Let's start at the top. We have decreased blood pressure to the kidneys. Kidneys secrete renin, follow the arrow over to the right side, and it's going to meet with angiotensinogen, which came from the liver. That's going to get converted to angiotensin 1. It's going to circulate through the lungs, where angiotensin converting enzyme is going to convert it to angiotensin 2. Follow the arrow down. It causes very powerful vasoconstriction, which increases the blood pressure, and that is the completion of your negative feedback loop. Now, angiotensin 2 has another effect. It stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. And aldosterone is a steroid hormone that stimulates the kidneys to follow the arrow down, increase water reabsorption, and decrease urine volume. What this does is it causes the body to hold on to more fluid. And the more fluid your body holds, the higher the blood volume can be, and high blood volume increases blood pressure. Now, this effect, this aldosterone effect, is much slower, but it also lasts longer. You're going to retain fluid for a longer period of time. Let's go back to the vasoconstricting effects of angiotensin 2. There is an enzyme in the blood called angiotensinase, and angiotensinase is going to deactivate angiotensin 2 within just a minute or so. So the vasoconstricting effect of angiotensin 2 is very short term. And if your blood pressure is still too low, well, then your kidneys can just secrete more renin and go through that whole pathway again. But the kidneys are going to continue to respond to that aldosterone for hours. So you have a short-term vasoconstricting effect affecting the peripheral resistance, and then you have that longer-term, longer-lasting effect of aldosterone on the blood volume. Now, if the kidneys have an individual problem, that is, if it's not your systemic blood pressure that's low, it's just your kidney blood pressure that's low, then the kidneys are going to continue to secrete renin long term. So if you have stenosis of a renal artery, renin secretion is too high, and you have chronic hypertension as a result of stenosis of a renal artery. Aldosterone can be stimulated either by angiotensin II or by high potassium level. Aldosterone works by promoting an increase in the number of sodium-potassium exchange pumps in the ducts of the kidneys, and that causes reabsorption of sodium but excretion of potassium. And you remember that there are 3 sodiums for every 2 potassiums that are exchanged. That creates an osmotic effect, which increases water retention by the kidneys. Very slow acting, but it does slow the loss of water in the urine and retain blood volume. It doesn't actually increase blood volume. If you want to increase blood volume, then you need to drink some water. Aldosterone works with antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone works on a separate regulatory circuit. You remember that antidiuretic hormone is secreted by the posterior pituitary gland in response to low blood volume or a blood osmotic concentration that's too high, so dehydration if you just need to drink some water. Antidiuretic hormone is secreted to stimulate water retention by the kidneys. Again, we'll look at the mechanism of that when we get to the kidneys. So, but ADH has a secondary effect. If your blood pressure is precipitously low, then you secrete more ADH, and it has what we call a vasopressive effect. In fact, the other name for ADH is vasopressin. And at higher than usual levels, it can actually directly vasoconstrict the systemic arteries and raise the blood pressure. So here we see a diagram showing at the top osmoreceptors detecting increased osmotic pressure, or baroreceptors sending signals to that center in the hypothalamus that stimulates the secretion of ADH from the posterior pituitary, which has a greater effect on the kidney, but remember that's long term, and that vasoconstricting effect if the pressure is really low. So ADH has both an effect on peripheral resistance and an effect on blood volume. All right, next on our list of hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, which you are also assigned to learn. Go back to the endocrine chapter and read up on epi and norepi. They come from the adrenal medulla, stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. Systemically, they are going to stimulate vasoconstriction in the arteriolar system, possibly also in the venous drainage. And yes, they stimulate the heart as well, but we've already finished studying the heart. So the effect of epi and norepi, as we learned when we studied the endocrine system, is to augment and prolong sympathetic vasomotor effects. So sympathetic effects occur in milliseconds and last for minutes. Epinephrine and norepinephrine as hormones are secreted within minutes and can last for hours. And here you see the pathway by which the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla to secrete epi and norepi. Go back to the autonomic nervous system and study that pathway. All right, now the antagonistic hormones, the hormones that do the opposite of those, are ANP and BNP. ANP was first isolated from the right atrium. It's secreted when there's chronically stretched atrial walls due to high blood volume. It is an antagonist to both aldosterone and ADH, and therefore it has effects both on the kidneys by increasing the loss of water, increasing urine output, and decreasing blood volume, but also by blocking ADH's effect on the blood vessels. It's a vasodilator. BNP was first isolated from the brain. It's used actually clinically as a drug, BNP is. And later it was found to be secreted by the right ventricle. So the atria secrete a hormone and the ventricle secrete a hormone, and they have the same effect. They are antagonistic to aldosterone and ADH. They block their effects. All right, so we have these two classes of effects. We can affect the peripheral resistance through vasomotor effects, and then we have the renal effects by regulating blood volume. Remember that renal effects can only reduce water loss through the urine. They can't really raise the blood volume. They just prevent it from going any lower than it has to. Or they can do the opposite. So the ANP and BNP can increase urine output and therefore lower blood volume. Again, if you actually need to increase blood volume, you're going to do it by stimulating the thirst pathways. And by the way, that's a third effect of angiotensin II. It stimulates the thirst center in the brain. And people that have really low blood pressure, usually from hypovolemic shock from hemorrhage, often have such a powerful thirst response that you're sitting there telling them, you know, you're near death, who do I want to contact for you? And all they're telling you is that they're thirsty. That's always a bad sign. So here's just a summary of, on the left, you've got the peripheral resistance changes, and on the right, you have the renal effects. So be sure you know which hormones do which and how they work. And there's a very busy slide showing you the diagram out of your book, so you can follow that along in your textbook. Okay, so a concept check. If a woman's CAT scan shows a tumor pressing on the left renal artery, what's that going to do? What is that going to do to her blood pressure? See if you can figure that one out. And if you have a snake bite victim in Australia with a blood pressure of 80/50, what do you want to give them? Epinephrine, aldosterone, or A and P and Y? See if you can answer those questions. You can ask me in class if you want to check those answers. All right, so that's the end of part 4, and this is going to be, I believe, the last part, part 5, on routing of blood flow.